Hello, I'm Alice, Education Consultant for LCP, and today we're going to be looking at the approach to iASEND. So this presentation is designed to assist in providing an insight into the benefit of the formative approach, to understand the difference between barriers to learning and labels, to inform of best practice when using iASEND, and an opportunity to reflect on your current practice. So I thought it would be worthwhile starting with the background of iASEND. So I've got two little quotes here. iASEND stem from the need to make sense of raw pupil data. We need to be able to use the information to demonstrate how well children were progressing and to make sense of their attainment year on year. Now, this quote is taken from Dr. Sue Fisher, who is the author of our programme. I also considered the impact of various labels, such as ASD or physical disability, and appreciated that these labels or primary need don't really help us when analysing data. For example, ASD could be a child's primary need, but the same label could be attached to a child who is locked in, has very little awareness of self or others, and profound learning needs, or a child who excels academically and ends up with a PhD in maths or astrophysics. So I next wanted to come on to, are we achieving the result that we want for our SEND community? And if not, what needs to change? So obviously, when we're implementing change, we need to be thinking about what we need to do, our plan. Then we need to be thinking about the actions that we undertake, and only then do we think about the behaviour and it becoming an automatic thing. So that's something to bear in mind. So we also need to be thinking about the labels. So as I'm sure you're aware that we've had ADHD, autistic, ODD, MLD, SEMH, SPLD, gifted and talented. These are all labels, but do they really help you actually analyse any data? And perhaps actually it's worth thinking differently. So obviously you've already bought into iASEND, so you're probably very well aware about the barriers to learning. So we've got barriers to learning, and those are cognition, behavioural, physical and sensory. Now, when identifying those barriers to learning, it's thinking about what is the impact that, if they've got the label ASD, is it that it's cognitive? Is it behavioural? Is it physical? Is it sensory? What is the impact of that label on the child's learning? So as you can see here, this is where we've got the ability to set up those barriers to learning, and you can see that information there where you can hover over the dots and that will give you an explanation behind it. So I've also got another quote here, and this is from the Special Educational Needs and Disability Review of 2010. And it's, are we identifying SEND children correctly? So at present, the term special educational needs is used too widely. Around half the schools and early years provisions visited use low attainment and relatively slow progress as their principal indicators of special educational needs. In nearly a fifth of these cases, there was very little further assessment. Inspectors saw schools that identified pupils as having special educational needs when in fact there were no needs that were different from most of the other pupils. They were underachieving, but this was sometimes simply because the child's mainstream teaching provision were not good enough and expectations of the pupils were too low. So actually, are we identifying children correctly? Does it just need to be SEND children on iASEND? And this is actually why iASEND is such a planning tool, because actually, as you can see here, that, perhaps the teaching provision isn't where it should be. And are we, putting in those small steps of learning, not just for, children with SEND, but children also who are just making slower progress. So I've also got an example here of a child. So this is Seamus, and Seamus is somebody, I'm a former teacher if you're unaware, and Seamus was a year 5 pupil that came to my school. Now, when he came to us, he was classed as working towards, he'd been at another school before, he'd done 1 year in our school, and he was sort of told to me that he was working around the year 3 level for both English and maths. Now, he'd been in our school for 2 years and could only use a laptop to write. If I gave him anything else other than laptop, he would kick off. He regularly refused to do work and often cried under the table when he refused, which obviously, as you can imagine, disrupted the rest of the class. And he was put on the SEND register due to lack of progress and attainment. Now, so when working with Seamus, I sort of worked with him about the barriers to learning. So we identified that it was clearly the fine motor skills, and that was related to the handwriting, and it was also the learnt helplessness. He needed to build up his resilience. So how do we overcome those? So what we did is we focused on using sort of many handwriting interventions, and it's going right back to basics, from building up that hand strength to later on we were using yellow highlighted lines so that he still had effectively the handwriting lines, which you can see here as an example if you're unfamiliar with that technique. So he still had that, effectively those handwriting lines in his book, so he was constantly implementing that, and also the expectation of how much he was going to write. We narrowed that down and said, you know, we want just one beautiful sentence of writing, because actually it was important for him to learn how to physically write with a pencil. And so the outcome was that actually he built huge amount of resilience, not just in the handwriting in the English department, but actually in everything, even in sport and all the different areas, because we really focused on those. Actually, the expectation was that he should just always write on a laptop, which is great, but he couldn't even write, you know, a few words in the pencil. And actually, that's a life skill, just to be able to jot some notes down if you know, in a situation. So, and what we did find is that when Ofsted came, it was marked, they couldn't believe the progress, because he went from a child who was writing as sort of like a reception child would, all the way up to very much almost working in terms of his handwriting at age-related expectations. He was actually classed, although when he came to me he was working at a year 3 standard, when he got to, by the time he entered year 5, he was working at age-related expectations for year 5, and actually with hints of greater depth, and by the end of year 6 he was classed as greater depth year 6 in his writing. So actually he came on leaps and bounds just from those areas that we focused on. So actually, was the expectations too low for him when he first started in our school? iASEND could have helped me, because obviously we didn't have it in our school, but it could have helped me because I would have been able to identify the small steps. Instead, I was having to spend hours Googling interventions, you know, finding those small steps myself. Whereas if I'd had that resource, I could have literally just gone to it and used it to plan my intervention, plan those next steps. So it would have saved me hours of time. And you can see here, I've just got an example. If I'd had iASEND, I would have just been able to move those dots along, and I would have demonstrated that progress. I mean, with Seamus, it was very obvious to show that progress through his book, because it was a handwriting, but things like behaviour isn't always obvious to an Ofsted inspector, and also being able to demonstrate that to parents. So iASEND would have been very helpful. And as I said, this is where this iASEND would have been helpful, because I would have been able to show that progress. And actually, Seamus was a very intelligent boy. He would have benefited from seeing that progress as well, because actually he was always classed as working towards, until he came to me, where he then was at age-related expectations. But I think the family were almost a little bit in disbelief, because it was such a huge amount of progress in such a short period of time. So, as I've mentioned about iASEND being used formatively, I'm going to sort of keep going with that message, that actually I've got an example here about what the difference between summative and formative is. So formative is to guide in planning, improve instruction, and to improve learning, and it's before or during the instruction. Summative is to inform and assess the level of accomplishment towards a learning objective, and it's the end of instruction. So why do we use formative and summative assessment? So as I mentioned, formative is used to inform the planning, summative is used to summarise the learning. So actually, as a teacher, although obviously both are important, would you arguably say one is more important than the other? And which is going to have a greater impact on the student? Is telling a child that they're working towards or working at a year 2 level going to actually help them? So going on from that, how do you record formative assessment in your school? Because understandably, your school will be using formative assessment. Do you use assessment to inform your planning? Which I presume you probably do. So how do you plan for those pupils? And do teachers take the national curriculum learning objectives straight from the page, or do they already break it down into smaller steps? And are your teachers using iASEND to break down the national curriculum learning objectives? So iASEND is a formative assessment tool. We get many comments about how many objectives there are. And yes, there are many objectives because obviously we need to be capturing all areas of learning, but no teacher is expected to do all the objectives in one go. We very much recommend using it in a formative approach. That means that your teachers will be selecting a certain amount of objectives that they're going to focus on for over the course of that week or 2 weeks. And then they're going to come back and they're going to be saying how many times they've seen that learning. Not only is that going to provide accurate assessment, it's going to help teachers to plan for the next learning, whether that's intervention or in the mainstream classroom. It's going to make sure that it's up to date, and it's going to capture that progress between half terms. And it will also save on your teacher's workload. So here's an example of some planning. This took me about 5 minutes. Now, in our school, we used to use the S planning. This may or may not be familiar with you. So just to give you an idea, so the S is a journey that the children will be taking. We might do little diversions, but this is the journey that the children are going to be doing over that term, and we focus on those objectives and make notes around the objectives. So here we've got is that learning objective. I can understand what's being read to me. Then you can see I have literally plucked the objectives out. So I've got lesson 1 is 209. I can understand both the books I can already read accurately and fluently to those I listen to. Then I've got in a familiar story, I can jump in with the next word or phrase when the adult pauses. Then I've got I can answer questions such as where is this, what is this, who is this, using the preferred mode of communication. And then I've got I can recount a short sequence of events. So you can see here I've got there's 5 lessons, that's a course of a week, and those are all objectives just taken from iASEND. And you may have iASEND for specific pupils, but there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't use it for other children in your class, because presumably they're not just going to do one objective in one day. They're going to be doing, in terms of the national curricular objectives, you're going to have to break that down further. And then what I've done is I've got that evidence of learning. So I've literally got that overall objective, and then I've got the lesson objective, and then I've got comments underneath. So again, obviously this child's a year 1 child, so they're not going to be able to write that objective. So I would just stick that in the child's book, and then I would obviously do that information afterwards. So it's just making it really clear that the assessment is linking to the planning, which is linking to the learning. So iASEND does demonstrate significant breakthroughs. Horizontal learning, recalling and demonstrating in a range of contexts, is just as important as vertical learning, acquiring new knowledge and skills. And that's a quote taken from Dr. C. Fisher, and I'm sure something you would agree with. So as you can see, we've got the ability to move the objectives, the depth of learning for each objective. So we've got not met, which is not observed, shallow, which is observed in 1 lesson, emerging in 2, developing in most lessons, and functional in all contexts. So that's everything from me. If you need any help with implementing iASEND as a formative approach, do get in touch with me. But thank you ever so much for watching. Bye-bye.